What if I told you that the greatest enemy of the pioneer in the Wild West was not bandits or harsh weather, but the endless empty space? The empty, boundless sky and bare plains could break the will stronger than any enemy. In this world without shelter, building a house was not just a mundane task, but a major battle for the right to call this land their own. It was a battle to create a landmark in the chaos, to assert their presence in the midst of the vast emptiness. Pioneers had to start from absolute zero, with nothing but natural materials in their own hands. Watch the video to the end to learn how settlers, without modern tools, built sturdy dwellings and what one secret material allowed them to build walls literally out of grass. I will reveal the best-kept secret. It was not only the wild nature that prevented survival on the frontier, but also one's own mind. When a family of settlers arrived at their plot, they often saw nothing but grass swaying in the wind as far as the eye could see. The absence of trees, hills, or any familiar landmarks created powerful psychological pressure. This was the first and perhaps the most difficult test they had to endure. The human mind seeks shelter, protection, a point of reference. The American plains offered none of these things, presenting themselves as an ocean of earth. The first weeks of life in a simple wagon in the middle of this emptiness were a test of fortitude. Many described the feeling as one of constant vulnerability and insecurity. Therefore, building the first, even the most primitive, shelter was not so much an engineering task as a psychological one. It was a way to drop anchor in this boundless space. Creating walls, even the flimsiest ones, was an act of defining the boundaries of one's world. The pioneers struggled not with the material, but with the feeling of their own insignificance in the face of nature. The task of building a house seemed impossible when there were no ready-made resources around. All the building materials had to be found first, then obtained, and only then used. The first step in construction was not laying the foundation, but making a decision. The decision to stay and turn this foreign landscape into home was the main driving force behind the entire process. The settler had to mentally see a house where there was only sun-scorched earth. It was a daily struggle against the desire to give up and return to civilization. Every tree felled or sod cut was a small victory over this inner emptiness. People were not just building walls, they were building their future and their right to be there. That is why the very process of construction, no matter how exhausting it was, often had a therapeutic effect. Monotonous physical labor allowed them to focus on a specific task. People saw the direct result of their efforts. Here was a bare plot of land, and now a wall was rising. The process of turning chaos into order began in the mind. Settlers had to mentally divide the vast space into theirs and others. The house became the center of this own world, the point from which a new life began. Many historians agree that it was this psychological resilience that was the main tool of the pioneers. The ability to not break down under the pressure of emptiness was more important than the ability to wield an axe. Only by overcoming the fear of space could one begin to build a physical shelter. This first invisible battle determined everything that followed. Those who were able to win it gained something more than just a roof over their heads. They gained complete control over their destiny and their surroundings. We would be very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think was more difficult, physical labor or psychological pressure? Write about it in the comments. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our stories. Are you ready to learn the truth about how one single tool was more important than a rifle, a plow, and a wagon combined? That tool was the American axe. In the hands of a pioneer, it transformed from a simple tool into a universal means of conquering the wilderness. Without it, the very idea of construction would have been unthinkable. The American woodcutting axe was the pinnacle of engineering of its time. It had a perfectly balanced, heavy head and a long, slightly curved handle made of durable hickory. This design allowed for powerful and precise strikes, cutting deep into the wood. Unlike its European counterparts, it was designed for quickly felling large trees. The first task of the axe was to clear the land. Before building, it was necessary to create the building site itself. Dozens, even hundreds of trees around the future house were cut down to ensure safety and a supply of wood. This work required tremendous endurance and weeks of monotonous labor. Then the axe was used to fell timber for construction. The pioneer carefully selected the straightest and tallest pines or oaks. He had to not only cut down the tree, but also do so in such a way that it fell in the right direction. A mistaken calculation could ruin a valuable trunk or lead to injury. Axe handling was an art that was passed down from generation to generation. The speed of construction, the strength and warmth of a house depended on a person's ability to use this tool. The axe was not just a piece of metal on a stick, but an extension of the pioneer's arm. But what if you don't even have trees to chop down? In the next chapter, we will reveal the secret of how pioneers built houses from what was literally under their feet. What I am about to show you breaks all the stereotypes about the Wild West. When we think of pioneers, we imagine log cabins. But on the Great Plains in Nebraska, Kansas, or Dakota, there were practically no trees. It was impossible to build a log house, so the settlers turned to the only material available, earth. This is how the sod house came into being. It was a unique phenomenon born of harsh necessity. Pioneers literally built their homes from the grass that grew beneath their feet. These dwellings became a symbol of survival on the endless plains. The main tool for such construction was a special plow. This plow was designed to cut through the dense, root-entangled layer of sod. It cut long strips about 30 centimeters wide and 10 centimeters thick. These strips were the building bricks. Cutting the sod was hard work. The strips were incredibly dense and heavy due to the intertwined roots of perennial grasses. They were cut into bricks about half a meter long. One such block could weigh up to 20 kilograms. The process of laying the walls resembled ordinary brickwork. The layers of turf were laid on top of each other, grass side down, with overlapping joints. The walls turned out to be very thick, sometimes up to a meter at the base. This provided incredible strength and thermal insulation. Such walls had their own unique properties. In summer, the turf house was cool, as the thick layer of earth did not let the heat through. In winter, it kept the heat in perfectly, protecting against the piercing winds and blizzards that raged on the plains. However, sod houses also had serious drawbacks. The biggest problem was moisture. During heavy rains, the roof and walls could leak. Constant dampness was an inevitable part of life in such a house. The walls also settled during the first year, sometimes by several centimeters, which led to the deformation of door and window openings. Interior walls were often covered with fabric or newspapers to hide the bare earth. Small particles of soil could fall from the ceiling, or plant roots could break through. Despite all the difficulties, the turf house was a real salvation. It provided immediate shelter and protection from the elements. It was an ingenious solution that allowed people to survive and settle in a seemingly uninhabitable area. If you find such little-known facts of history fascinating, please support our channel with a like. Guess what one mistake in choosing a location for a house could cost a settler everything he had. For those who built with wood instead of turf, choosing the right location for a hut was the first and most important strategic decision. Not only comfort, but life itself depended on it. The first and foremost factor was access to fresh water. Settlers always tried to build near a stream, river, or spring. Water was necessary for drinking, cooking, and hygiene. Carrying water long distances every day would have been an unacceptable waste of energy. At the same time, it was important not to build too close to the water. Spring floods and sudden floods could wash away a house and all its contents in an instant. Experienced pioneers chose a place on a small hill, out of reach of high water, but close enough to be within walking distance. The second factor was access to construction timber. A hut required hundreds of logs. Carrying them several kilometers was a tremendous task. Therefore, the ideal location was a clearing at the edge of a forest or a plot with a good supply of straight, tall trees. The pioneers preferred certain types of trees. Pine, spruce, or poplar were ideal for walls. They were straight and relatively easy to work with. For the foundation and chimney, they looked for sturdy oak or other hard materials. The third factor was protection. The location for the house had to provide a good view of the surrounding area. This allowed any approaching threat to be noticed in time. Building in a deep valley or at the foot of a cliff was considered unsafe. A small hill or gentle slope was the ideal location. They provided a strategic advantage and protection from surprise attacks. It was also important to have open space around the house to prevent anyone from sneaking up unnoticed. The decision made on the first day determined the entire future life in this place. The settler had to think like an engineer, strategist, and farmer at the same time. What do you think was the decisive factor? Access to water or the availability of wood? In the next chapter, we will learn how a bare tree trunk was turned into building material. The process of turning a living tree into building material was the basis of all construction and required incredible effort. First, the pioneer went into the forest and selected suitable trees. They had to be as straight as possible, approximately the same diameter, and without signs of rot. Most often, they chose pine trees that grew tall and straight. After selecting the tree, the felling process began. Using an axe, a V-shaped notch was made on one side of the trunk to determine the direction of fall. A straight cut was made on the opposite side. It was dangerous work that required precision and the ability to predict how a multi-ton trunk would behave. When the tree fell, the work was not over, but only just beginning. The first thing to do was to cut up the trunk. All the branches and twigs were chopped off with an axe, from the top to the butt. The result was a long, bare trunk, ready for further processing. Then the logs had to be delivered to the construction site.
Get this load moving.
This was one of the most labor-intensive
Come on, you
tasks.
brutes, pull.
If there were oxen nearby, the logs were dragged along the ground. If the settler was alone, he had to use his wits. He could use a system of levers and rollers, smaller logs placed under the main trunk. Slowly, centimeter by centimeter, he moved the logs, weighing many hundreds of kilograms, to his site. It was monotonous and exhausting work that took days. Once the logs were in place, they had to be prepared for laying in the wall. First, they were sanded down. Using an axe or a special scraper, all the bark was removed from the logs. This was done to prevent rot and protect the wood from damage. The next step was chipping, or giving the logs a flat shape. Although many huts were built from round logs, houses made of hewn logs were considered to be of higher quality. They fit more tightly together and required less sealant. Each log required an individual approach. It could take a whole day's work to prepare a single log for a wall. Considering that a hut required between 50 and 100 such logs, one can imagine the scale of the entire undertaking. This titanic labor was the basis of survival. What if I told you that the secret to the strength of a log cabin lay not in nails, but in a simple notch? Nails were incredibly expensive and rare on the frontier. Therefore, pioneers relied on a centuries-old technology, joining logs with locks or notches. A notch is a cut made in a log that allows it to be joined to another log at a right angle. It was these joints at the corners of the house that gave the entire structure its rigidity and strength. The quality of their workmanship determined how warm and durable the dwelling would be. The simplest and quickest type of notch was a saddle-shaped or simple bowl. A semicircular notch was simply cut out on the underside of the log with an axe. The log was placed on top of another log perpendicular to it, like a saddle. It was quick, but such corners were very drafty. This method often left large gaps between the logs. It was suitable for temporary shelters or farm buildings. For a residential building, something more reliable was needed. The V-shaped notch was more sophisticated. A V-shaped wedge was cut into the lower log, and a corresponding groove was cut into the upper log. This joint was tighter and provided better protection from the wind. It required greater precision in marking and cutting. Such joints prevented the logs from shifting sideways. Walls assembled in this way were much stronger.
This cabin will stand.
This method was popular in many regions of the American frontier. However, the dovetail joint was considered the pinnacle of carpentry skill. It was the most difficult but also the strongest joint. A complex trapezoidal spike resembling a tail was cut at the end of the log. This tenon was inserted into an identical groove on the adjacent log. Such a joint was not only airtight, but also tightened itself under the weight of the structure. The logs could not move apart either longitudinally or transversely. Houses assembled with a dovetail joint were the warmest and most durable. They were often built from hewn logs, which made the walls almost monolithic. However, the manufacture of such a lock required high skill, a keen eye, and a lot of time. The entire process of cutting the notches was done with only an axe. The carpenter had to accurately calculate the angle and depth of each cut. A mistake in one lock could disrupt the geometry of the entire wall. Which of these techniques do you find the most difficult to perform? Next, we will talk about the most exciting part, assembling the walls. When all the logs were prepared and the locks were cut into them, the most important stage began, the assembly of the log house. This process required not only strength, but also incredible precision. One wrong move could ruin all the work of many days. First, the foundation was laid. In frontier conditions, it was simple. Large flat stones were laid at the corners of the future house. These stones served as supports and protected the lower logs, the crown molding, from contact with damp ground and rot. The first two logs, the most massive and well-hewn, were laid on these stones. They had to be positioned perfectly horizontally. For this, a primitive level was used, a container with water. The entire geometry of the house depended on how evenly the first crown was laid. Then the next two logs were laid perpendicularly, closing the first crown. The corners were carefully adjusted, and the locks had to fit tightly without gaps. This first square was the foundation of the entire house. Further work consisted of sequentially adding crowns. Log by log, the wall rose higher and higher. The first few levels could be laid alone, simply by rolling the logs into place. But the higher the wall became, the more difficult the task. It was impossible to lift a log weighing several hundred kilograms to human height without outside help. That is why the tradition of cabin raising was so widespread on the frontier. Neighbors from all over the area would come together to help the new family. This day turned into a real celebration and a demonstration of mutual support. Working together, the men quickly erected the walls. It was a well-coordinated team effort where everyone knew their task. To lift heavy logs, they used slides, two long poles placed against the wall at an angle. The log was tied with ropes and pulled up along these guides. Other men at the top caught it and carefully placed it in position. The work required tremendous coordination and was very dangerous. A log that slipped could cause serious injury. The process was usually supervised by the most experienced carpenter, who gave orders and ensured that the logs were laid correctly. Building the roof was perhaps the most difficult and labor-intensive stage after assembling the log house. The walls were ready, but they did not provide protection from rain and sun. It was necessary to create a reliable roof, and this required new engineering solutions. First, the gables were formed, triangular ends of the end walls.
Shift it slightly to
do this, each subsequent crown on these walls was made shorter than the previous one. The logs were laid to form a slope that determined the future angle of the roof. Then longitudinal beams, or slegs, were laid on these sloping gables. The topmost beam was called the ridge beam and was the longest and strongest. These slegs served as the base to which the roofing material would be attached. The biggest problem was the roofing material. The pioneers did not have metal or tiles. The most common and affordable material was shingles or chips. These were long, thin wooden plates. The process of making shingles was a separate craft. For this, trees with straight and easily split wood were selected, such as cedar, oak, or pine. The trunk was sawn into short logs about half a meter long. Then a special tool called a colon or drach was used. It was a long knife with a handle, which was struck with a wooden mallet. The craftsman placed the blade on the end of the log and chipped off a thin strip. This work was long and monotonous. Thousands of such shingles were needed to cover one small roof. The whole family, including the women, was often busy with this work. The quality of the shingles depended on the skill of the craftsman and the straightness of the wood. When the shingles were ready, they were laid on the rafters. The laying began at the lower edge of the roof and moved upward toward the ridge. Each subsequent row overlapped the previous one, creating a cascading system through which water flowed down. The shingles were not nailed down, as there were no nails. They were either pressed down with additional poles laid on top or fastened to wooden pegs. Such a roof was not completely waterproof, but it provided good protection from precipitation. A poorer or more hasty option was a roof covered with bark. In spring, during sap flow, bark could be stripped from large trees in whole sheets. These sheets were laid on the roof and weighed down with stones or logs. Building the roof was the final step in creating the box of the house. It required no less, and perhaps even more, carpentry skill than erecting the walls. Only then could the pioneer say with relief that he had a roof over his head. The log house was assembled, the roof was in place, but the house was not yet ready for winter. There were significant gaps and cracks between the logs, especially if they were round. In cold weather, the wind blew through the hut, blowing out all the heat. The next important stage began, chinking. This was the process of sealing the walls. The pioneers had to carefully fill every crack, even the smallest ones. Comfort and survival during the winter months depended directly on this. The caulking process consisted of two parts: chinking, filling, and daubing, plastering. First, the large gaps between the logs had to be filled with something. Any available materials were used for this purpose. These could be wood chips left over from hewing logs. They were hammered into the gaps, creating a solid foundation. Dried moss collected in the forest was also often used. Moss was an excellent natural insulator. When all the large gaps were filled, they proceeded to the second stage, coating. It was necessary to create a sealed layer that would protect the insulation from moisture and secure it in place. For this, a special solution was prepared. The simplest coating composition is clay mixed with water. Clay was widely available and had good binding properties. However, in its pure form, it cracked when it dried. To make the mortar more durable and plastic, reinforcing components were added to it. Most often, these were dry grass, straw, or even horsehair. These fibers acted as reinforcement, preventing the clay from cracking and crumbling. The hut was almost ready, but it was just an empty wooden box. To turn it into a home, a hearth had to be created. The fireplace and chimney were the heart of the pioneer dwelling, the center around which all life revolved. Building a fireplace was the most fire-hazardous and difficult task. It was usually built against one of the end walls. A space for it was cut directly into the log wall. It was a large opening from floor to ceiling. The foundation for the fireplace was made of large flat stones, so that the heavy structure would not sag and cause a fire. The hearth itself and the lower part of the chimney were laid out with stones found on the banks of rivers. The same clay was used as mortar. Finding a sufficient number of suitable stones was a great stroke of luck. If there were no stones, the fireplace and chimney were made using the wattle and daub technique. This was a more primitive but common construction method. First, a frame for the chimney was woven from strong branches and poles. It had the shape of a tapered pipe. This frame served as the basis for applying a thick layer of clay plaster, the same kind used for caulking. The clay was mixed with grass and applied layer by layer, both outside and inside. The inner layer was made especially thick and smooth to protect the wattle from fire. After drying, the clay became as hard as brick. Such a chimney was a constant source of concern. The clay could crack from the heat, and flying sparks could set fire to the wooden frame or the roof itself. The settlers had to constantly monitor the condition of the chimney and repair it in time. We can see that the journey from a bare plot of land to a finished hut was a real epic. Each stage of this process, from psychological preparation to caulking the cracks, required incredible endurance, ingenuity, and versatile skills from the pioneer. He had to be a lumberjack, carpenter, engineer, and bricklayer all rolled into one. What other topics from the life of pioneers or the history of the American frontier would you like to see on our channel? Perhaps you are interested in how they defended their farms or how they survived the harsh winters? Share your ideas in the comments and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new episodes.